the first order of business is to create something that looks like this, and it's called a scarf. You can see we've got that initial weld. These pieces are welded but not blended, and that's because we don't want this to get too small, so we can create this scarf. And I'm going to explain the how and the why we need a scarf, but first I want to go over some terminology. The very tip is called the toe. This little piece here is the heel, and you can kind of see if you turned it upside down, it kind of looks like the heel of a shoe. And then this area right here, inexplicably to me, is called the neck. I think it should probably be an ankle at this point if we're going with the foot analogy, but most people refer to it as a neck. So to get here, we need to revisit the forge weld discussion where we talk about the location of the blow. And in the faggot weld, it was pretty simple. Everything was lined up, kind of ready to go. In this case, we have two disparate pieces of metal that we want to weld together in such a way that we've got it back to the parent bar. We really don't want it any thinner than that with which we started. So if we're going to put these two together and this becomes our welding plane, you're going to hit from this side or this side, exactly the directions that the arrows are going. If we were going to lap one piece over the other piece, this then becomes the welding plane, and our hammer blows are going to come from here or here. And any other kind of blow, like hitting from the sides, from this direction, or even hitting right on top, creates a shear plane or will cause that weld to fall apart rather than to weld. So here's a little graphic showing our two pieces of metal and how we have our welding plane right in the middle, hammer blows coming from somewhere in the perpendicular-ish family to engage those two pieces of metal in a way that welds them. But I just got done telling you all about this shear plane, and that's what this is on the end. So now I'm going to get into why we've got to create that scarf, because if we hit this just as is, this little bit of business is going to shove itself right down into that bottom piece of metal and create a crack that you can't blend in. And I encourage you to do this as an experiment. I did it as an experiment or a proof of concept, and that this is exactly what happens. You end up with this little crack. What we want is to outsmart the metal and just create a taper at the end. The taper at the end gets everything into more of a welding plane. You can see that this is already kind of blending in to this plane right here. And as you perform these hammer blows, it'll all blend in nicely and you'll end up with this line. I have a microscopic view of a weld that I'm going to show in a little bit. So remember this line because you'll get to see it again up close and personal. So we've got a taper that we need to put on the end of our piece to start our scarf. And we're going to be hitting it from on top. And remember that we've got already squishy metal that we have super, super hot. This is going to move a lot. So as you hit it on top, this top piece is going to move a lot faster than the bottom piece. In fact, the bottom piece probably isn't going to move much at all. So it's going to stay the size that we started with. And the reason for that is, or one way to think about that is just this piece becomes an extension of the anvil. So if we did a little thought experiment and we had a piece of metal, and I don't care how big, suspended by some hefty duty fireproof rope, and the whole thing's hot. If you hit this with everything you've got, you're still only going to deform this end. The rest of this bar isn't impacted by that hammer blow. And one way to think about it is it's acting like its own anvil. So knowing that the top's going to move a lot more than the bottom, to get ahead of that little problem, you're going to thin the toe of the scarf. Essentially, you're making a three-sided taper, flat on the bottom, but this comes to a point this way, and from top down, the width is going to be narrow. So there's our three-sided taper. We've got our toe created, and we know why we're making the toe. Next is this little indent right here, this little step. The reason for that is you want to monitor how long your weld is. If you did a really long weld, you're setting yourself up for a couple problems. And there's some YouTubers out there that I see they do this as a rule. They make really long scarves and they weld them that way. So I know it's possible, but heating both sides of both pieces to the same temperature with the same length back of the heat, like you want a good long heat on that bar, is going to be more difficult to keep all that even if you need an even longer piece. So I opt for shorter, and that's what the step gets you. You put a little step in there, and now I can match these up to a nice short weld. The other thing this helps you with is we're in a race against time, and the longer this is, the more likely it is you'll end up with some oxidation or some kind of dirt under there that if you've got a nice short welding plane, you can avoid. You'll still end up with some in there, and we can even see some on the microscopic views that I promised you. But the shorter, the better. But you'll notice everything's nice and thick here, which leads us to the neck of our scarf, and that is this area right here. When we go to weld this, we're going to hit it on top, and then that hammer is going to follow this angle down, which makes this area very vulnerable to an errant hammer blow, as well as loss of material through oxidation. So it's a good idea to thicken this before we go. And that's either by upsetting it and making the parent stalk a little wider, or by starting with a piece that's a little thicker to begin with. So just in summary, this is what we have to make this is what we have to do to make a scarf and a nice short weld. So let's do that. Let's put a scarf on the end of our already welded bar. Now, when you're doing this, when you're putting the scarf in there, I would recommend that you keep that at the bright orange or yellow heat. Don't let it sparkle. You'll just lose material, but keep it nice and hot so as to encourage these pieces to stay together. First bit of business, just make a short taper. And as with any taper, you're making a point, so get to the point. Make that point first before you do anything else. And then by just so when you're making your taper, you have this up at an angle and you have your hammer at an angle to get this point made. Then lay this flat on the anvil and just flatten that one side, and voila, you have a three-sided taper. Now we can use the side of the anvil or a hardy block on the anvil to put our step in place. You don't want a deep step. You want it over a rounded edge, because you don't want to create another shear plane in the middle of this piece. You want a nice rounded edge, and then if this got deformed, which it will as you go through these steps, you'll hit it once on top to create the step, and then angling your hammer so that you smooth out this taper. If that doesn't go well at all, that's not a big deal either. You can always just cut it off. And by holding your chisel straight up and down, when all you've got is this little bit to take off, you'll notice that since there's hardly any resistance removing this little nubbin, you're going to end up with a taper here. So won't even have to worry about that. Then it'll just be a matter of thinning the toes, putting your step, and then redefining that edge after you've put your step in place. So here's the video of a scarf in progress. Notice that it's being held on the square. That makes sure that it lies flat on the anvil to get to the next step. Bring it over to the side of the anvil to put your little step in there. And by dropping the material hand, you can reset that initial taper in there. So there it is. There's your scarf. So here I have that microscopic view of a weld that I promised you. And this white swath through the middle is, and this is all mild steel, that's iron. That's where the carbon got, I guess, burnt out of it. You can see the dark spots here. That's the carbon. But see how that's nice, that nice little wedge here? That's where the welds blended in to the two pieces of metal. So now we are going to scarf the shaft and prepare the other end in the same way we did our basket handle. The reason why I go right to forge welding the shaft onto my basket handle at this point, before I've even finished the basket handle, is for two reasons. One, I've already got that hot, I've scarfed it, it's ready to go, might as well stay the course. The other is forge welding the other end of the basket handle and getting the collar or even a shepherd's hook on there if you're using a propane forge is much easier when you can just hold on to the long shaft that you welded on rather than using tongs. So let's scarf the end of the shaft, and we're going to use 3/8 inch square bar, and we're going to heat it back about 3/4 of an inch to an inch, a very short heat. This is the one and only time where you can put your metal down in the fire at about a 45-degree angle. Any other time you're just asking for trouble because you're going to burn that tip or over oxidize the tip. But in this case, it'll get you a nice short heat, which allows you to hit it up here and thicken this part. And we call that upsetting. As you do that, you can see this is thickening, but it's also bending. It will bend. Always straighten it out before you continue. Once you've got that bend in there, drop it to the side, straighten it out, or the bend will just get bendier. So what we want is a nice thickening of this end here, just about 3/4 to 1/4 of an inch. Once we're here, go ahead and put the slant on there by angling this bar as you hit it on top. So angle it towards your hammer hand, and you'll end up with the start of that slant, which means you don't have to fuss with it later. The slant is already in place, that initial taper of your three-sided taper. Bring the material to the side. You want to keep it the width of the parent stock. That's going to keep it narrow enough and give you a little more height here, which gives you a little more material as you're forge welding and then blending in that forge weld so that you can keep the whole bar at a parent stock size when you're done. So back to parent stock on the sides, and then you can narrow in your toes. I tend to do all of my upsetting at the anvil. I think it's just easier. Or sometimes I have a swedge block that's a little lower. I'll use that instead of my anvil, depending on how long this shaft is. But another option is the post vise. The material, again, is only heated back 3/4 to 1 inch, so still a very short heat. It's not as critical that the heat is short when you put it in a post vise, because this material won't be bothered by what we're about to do to it. But what you do need to know is as you hit this on the end, this bar is going to come towards you. So get ahead of that by bending it away from you, and then hit, hit, hit until it's straight. And then when it's straight, you can angle your hammer to again get that slant started. But you notice we've got nice thickening here. We've got our three-sided taper, the top side of our taper started. And then it's just the same exercise as if you did this upsetting on the anvil. You bring it back flat on the anvil and you correct for any growth in width. So back to parent stock, and then you narrow the toes by angling your hammer, picking the piece up, because now it's just a taper. I would probably do this over at the edge of the anvil so as to not nick my anvil. And then set your step in place right on the edge of a rounded edge of your anvil. And you notice this edge got all warped. That's fine. You're going to hit it on top. And then as you angle your hammer to follow this down, lower this hand until you've got a nice even taper on the end. So let's watch that in motion here. So notice the nice short heat, and then right away go into the slant, and then back to the parent stock. And I know we're using square bar, and this happened with round bar, but it's the same thing. We're going to watch that. I think this goes through it one more time, using the block to set the step. And you're just that initial toe is just about 3/8 of an inch. So not very long. You want a short a scarf or a short of a step there as possible. And there it is. So you want your two pieces to match up. So if we had that basket handle scarf here, we would match those up, having as little space in between these two stepped edges as possible. And that is going to give you another head start in your race against time when you're forge welding, because you don't have to hit it to get it in close proximity to each other. If these scarves look very different, you'd have to hit them one on top of the other to get them to touch and then start your weld. Well, that might have been just enough time for you to lose your temperature. So having these as close to the same shape as possible is important. We are now ready to execute our drop tong weld. And the way we do that is by heating these two pieces up to welding temperature, brush them, flux them, reheat them to welding temperature, and then position them in such a way that the basket handle's on the bottom and the shaft is on the top. And this picture has a lot going on in it. The first is you see your hammer is ready to go. And this is a hammer ready for a right-handed smith to reach over the side of the anvil, which with this piece being held by their tongs, place it on the edge, and in their non-hammer hand, place this on the edge of the anvil. With both sides secured here, you can now drop this down on the anvil face, position this so that they match up. And the minute they match up, you can lift this hand because with pressure from the top of the handle, hold all of this in place, drop your tongs, pick up your hammer, hit it on top, follow that angle down. As long as this maintains that welding temperature, that bright orange or yellow heat, you can turn it over, hit it again on top, follow that angle down, blending in these toes as you go. At this point, I brush it, reflux it on all these sides, put it back in the fire, get it back to welding temperature, and go through this part where I hit it on top, blend in the toe. And so this is with the toe of the hammer, blending in the toe, turn it over. And now with the heel of the hammer, hit it on top, and then with the heel of the hammer, blend in the toe. Once you're happy with your weld, and again, that usually takes 2 or 3 welding heats and taps, then and only then do you want to start forging your 2 pieces together. And right here, we're hitting with everything in the nice welding plane. See how nice and even that is? But the minute you hit it on the side, you're hitting the shearing plane. And if this isn't well welded at this point, you could lose the weld, which isn't horrible. It's just a matter of brushing it, fluxing it, getting it heated again, and going back through those juggling steps to weld it and tack it again. But then making sure you keep it very hot the whole time you're forging this into shape until you've got it blended. It's a 1/2 inch here and down to 3/8 of an inch here, and nicely blended into shape. And you can see the weld here. So just to go back over this, and then we'll watch it on a video, you're going to bring your 2 pieces to a near welding temperature. You're going to brush them, flux them. Then you're going to reheat them. When you're reheating them, you're going to hold them in the fire at about the same spot. You don't want them dipped in the fire. You want them level. They should be level, horizontal with and parallel to the ground or with your forge. And about the same place together. They're about the same size. You're going to want to turn them a couple times. I usually get them up to welding temperature, and then I turn it, count to 5, turn them again, count to 5, and then once I cannot see it because the coal and the metal are the same color, I bring them out to do the juggling, which is the holding the basket handle with your tongs and your hammer hand on the far side of the anvil, securing it to the side of the anvil, putting them in place, and then dropping the tongs and picking up your hammer so that you can weld it. So let's watch this. I'm going to turn my laser pointer off because it's easier to stop and start this video that way. So tongs are over here. I'm actually going to stop this right here. Tongs are over here. Both pieces are touching the side of the anvil before they're touching each other. So the basket handle piece goes down first. This holds that down, and once it's held in place and you like where you've matched it up, you drop the tongs, pick up the hammer in one motion. This is slow-mo. Hit it on top, follow that down, turn it over. Same thing on the other side. So here's just another view. And notice really digging in that, blending in that toe. I'm going to back that up. We're going to watch this one more time, starting right here. So notice how nice and hot this is. That's a very good yellow heat. It's far back, and now it got reheated so that we could start the forging and blending that in. And you want to keep that at that yellow heat the whole time you're working with this. The scale from the flux is going to be extra thick. So as soon as you're done hammering, brush it right away. If you're going to reheat it and work on it some more, make sure that you've brushed it, fluxed it back in the fire. So here are some stills of forge welding, and just so we can talk about this a little bit. Here, notice how glass-like this is. This is very wet. These are two very evenly heated pieces to the right welding temperature. That dry, crusty look is out here, and if that were here, this would not be weldable. Here are two pieces where this is not the same temperature as the other piece. There's a range under which you can forge weld, but it's essential that both pieces are the same color, meaning they're the same temperature. This, if I saw this, if it was tacked, I would brush it, flux it, put it right back in the fire, and heat them both to welding temperature, starting with this on the bottom. If they weren't tacked at this point, I would brush them, flux them, reheat them in the fire, and then start over. Here's a piece that was hit on top here. This was on the anvil, but since you've got such nice color here and here, if you give this a second, all of this will be welding temperature. You could turn it over and hit that other side. The welding heat will follow this little cold piece here. So that's welding in a coal or coke forge. Let's move on to a propane forge option, and it's as simple as getting your two pieces prepared. No step, you just need that three-sided taper, and you're going to drill a little hole. In this case, it's about 1/8 of an inch, and then you'll take 1/8 of an inch rod and rivet them together. This spacer here, this washer, preserves the space. You want enough hanging out on the other side so that when you turn it over, you can rivet that side. So rivet the first side, holding it over the hole in this high-tech fancy bolster here, and then you turn it over. You no longer need the washer, and you rivet this other side. Now these pieces are securely placed together so that you can save the time it takes to position them together, put them in your propane forge, and when you bring it out, you're just ready to hit it. That's like a 1-2 hit. And then again, blend that to the 1/2 inch to the 3/8 of an inch. So let's watch that take place here. We're going to rivet these two pieces together. And again, I would just drill those holes. They're so tiny. And just tap it into place. Notice this is all happening with the rivet cold. Everything's cold, or you would not be touching it like that. Do want to keep everything straight. And now it's a matter of just heating that in your propane forge and blending in the toes, but only working this as long as that stays wet looking. Once this crust forms around your weld, you're done welding. So keep it nice and hot, chamfer all your corners. You want to do that whether you're coke welding or propane welding, and always brush that piece. I don't know if you noticed, but it gets that glassy surface. That's hard to get out if you don't brush that off right away when you're welding. So this is a weld even like magnified even more from the one we just saw. And you can see this, I'm told that this length is as thick as a piece of paper. So you can imagine how magnified that is. And this was probably just a little incursion or a little piece of dirt or scale in there. And then here's your weld.